Picture this. Two massive islands floating in the vast Pacific Ocean, seemingly forgotten by the world for millions of years. A place where birds ruled the land instead of mammals, where forests stretched endlessly without a single human footprint, and where the very ground beneath would shake and reshape itself through volcanic fury. This was New Zealand before anyone called it home. But how did this remote corner of the world transform from a land of giant flightless birds and ancient forests into a nation that would punch far above its weight on the global stage? The story we're about to unfold spans millions of years, from the breakup of ancient supercontinents to the arrival of Polynesian voyagers, from European colonization to modern nationhood. Today, we're diving deep into the complete history of New Zealand. We'll explore how these islands were born from geological chaos, witness the incredible journey of the first humans to reach these shores, and follow the dramatic events that shaped this nation into what it is today. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how a country with fewer people than most major cities became a global leader in everything from adventure tourism to environmental conservation. But first, let me give you a sense of just how extraordinary this story really is. We're talking about a land that remained hidden from human eyes longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. The last place where humans set foot. A country that went from Stone Age isolation to modern democracy in less than 2 centuries. This isn't just history. This is one of humanity's most remarkable tales of discovery, conflict, and transformation. Our story begins not thousands, but millions of years ago, when the very foundations of New Zealand were being forged in the depths of the earth. Long before any human had ever gazed upon the Pacific Ocean, New Zealand's story was already being written in stone and fire. Around 540 million years ago, these islands didn't exist as we know them today. Instead, they were part of a massive supercontinent called Gondwana, a colossal landmass that included what we now call Australia, Antarctica, South America, Africa, and India. But the Earth was restless. Deep beneath the surface, powerful forces were at work. Tectonic plates, those massive chunks of the Earth's crust, began their slow but relentless dance. Around 180 million years ago, Gondwana started to break apart like a giant jigsaw puzzle being pulled in different directions. This wasn't a quick process. We're talking about movements measured in centimeters per year over millions upon millions of years. As Gondwana split, New Zealand found itself on a fragment called Zealandia. Now here's where the story gets fascinating. Zealandia is actually a mostly submerged continent. If you could drain the Pacific Ocean, you'd see that New Zealand's North and South Islands are just the tips of a landmass roughly the size of India. The rest lies hidden beneath thousands of meters of seawater, making Zealandia the world's most mysterious continent. The separation from Gondwana was crucial for New Zealand's unique character. As these islands drifted away from the other landmasses, they carried with them a collection of plants and animals that would evolve in complete isolation. This isolation would become New Zealand's defining feature, creating a biological laboratory unlike anywhere else on Earth. But the geological drama was far from over. New Zealand sits on one of the most active tectonic boundaries in the world, where the Pacific Plate meets the Australian Plate. These two massive pieces of the Earth's crust grind against each other in a process that continues to this day. The result? A landscape shaped by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and mountain building on a scale that would humble any Hollywood disaster movie. The volcanic activity was particularly spectacular. The North Island became a hotbed of geothermal activity, with massive eruptions that could be heard for hundreds of kilometers. Lake Taupo, now a serene tourist destination, was formed by a volcanic eruption so powerful it ejected material across the entire country. This explosion, which occurred around 26,500 years ago, was one of the most violent volcanic events in Earth's recent history. Meanwhile, the South Island was being thrust skyward. The collision of tectonic plates created the Southern Alps, a mountain range that continues to grow even today. These peaks, some reaching over 3,700 meters high, were carved and sculpted by glaciers during multiple ice ages. The result is a landscape of breathtaking beauty, jagged peaks, deep fjords, and valleys that look like they were painted by the gods themselves. This geological violence had profound consequences for life on the islands. The constant reshaping of the land created isolated pockets where plants and animals could evolve without interference from outside species. Mountains rose to create barriers between different regions, while valleys and plains provided unique habitats for specialized life forms. As millions of years passed, New Zealand developed an ecosystem that was utterly unique. Without any native land mammals except for bats, birds took over many of the ecological roles that mammals filled elsewhere. This led to the evolution of some of the most extraordinary creatures ever to walk the earth. The most famous of these was the moa, a group of flightless birds that ranged from turkey-sized to absolute giants standing over 3 meters tall. These massive birds roamed the islands in huge numbers, some estimates suggesting there were millions of them. They filled the same ecological niche as large grazing mammals do elsewhere, shaping the landscape through their feeding habits. But the moa weren't alone in their flightlessness. New Zealand became home to an entire community of birds that had given up flight. The kakapo, a massive parrot that could weigh up to 4 kilograms, waddled through the forests at night. The weka, a rail the size of a chicken, scurried through the undergrowth. The takahe, with its brilliant blue and green plumage, grazed in the tussock grasslands like a feathered sheep. Why did so many birds give up flight? The answer lies in New Zealand's isolation and lack of ground predators. Without mammals to hunt them, these birds found it more efficient to walk and run than to maintain the energy-expensive ability to fly. Their wings shrank, their bones became denser, and they grew larger and more powerful. It was evolution in action, creating creatures perfectly adapted to their predator-free paradise. The forests themselves were unlike anything found elsewhere on Earth. Massive kauri trees, some of which had been growing for over 2,000 years, dominated the northern regions. These giants, with trunks so wide it would take a dozen people holding hands to encircle them, created cathedral-like spaces beneath their canopies. In the south, southern beech forests covered the mountainsides, while along the coasts, nikau palms marked New Zealand as the southernmost place on Earth where palm trees grew naturally. Ferns flourished in this environment like nowhere else. Tree ferns created fairy tale forests, where silver ferns unfurled their fronds in displays that would later become a national symbol. The diversity was staggering. New Zealand developed more species of ferns than any other country, many found nowhere else in the world. In the absence of large land predators, some truly unique creatures evolved to fill unusual niches. The tuatara, often mistaken for a lizard, is actually something far more special. The last survivor of an ancient group of reptiles that lived alongside the dinosaurs. These living fossils, with their distinctive, spiny crests and third eye, became New Zealand's most ancient inhabitants. The rivers and lakes teemed with native fish species that had evolved in isolation. Giant eels, some growing longer than a grown man, lurked in the deeper pools. Unique Galaxias species, small native fish with patterns like scattered stars, inhabited different river systems across the country. Even the insects were extraordinary. The weta, a group of large cricket-like insects, grew to enormous sizes in the absence of small mammals. Some species became giants of the insect world, with the largest individuals weighing as much as a mouse. These armored creatures, with their powerful jaws and spiny legs, looked like something from a prehistoric nightmare, but were actually gentle herbivores. This was the New Zealand that existed for millions of years, a land of giant birds and ancient forests, where the normal rules of nature didn't apply. It was a world in perfect balance, where every species had found its niche in an ecosystem shaped by isolation and geological drama. But this pristine wilderness was about to face its greatest challenge. Somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, a group of skilled navigators were preparing for a journey that would change everything. These weren't just any sailors. They were the Polynesian people, master voyagers who had already colonized islands across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. The Polynesians had developed navigation skills that bordered on the miraculous. Using nothing but the stars, ocean swells, wind patterns, and the flight paths of birds, they could sail across vast stretches of open water and find tiny islands with pinpoint accuracy. Their double-hulled canoes, loaded with everything needed to establish new settlements, were marvels of engineering perfectly adapted to long ocean voyages. For generations, these skilled navigators had been pushing eastward across the Pacific, settling islands in a great wave of human expansion. They had reached Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. They had discovered and colonized the remote islands of Hawaii and Easter Island. But one prize still awaited them: the largest landmass in the Pacific that remained uninhabited by humans. The journey to New Zealand would have been among the most challenging they had ever attempted. Unlike their previous island hopping, which involved relatively short jumps between visible islands, reaching New Zealand required sailing over 2,000 kilometers of open ocean with no certainty that land lay ahead. It was a leap of faith, backed by incredible skill and courage. We don't know exactly when the first Polynesian voyagers spotted the long white cloud that would give these islands their Māori name, Aotearoa, but we do know that sometime around 1280 AD, after millions of years of evolution in isolation, New Zealand was about to receive its first human inhabitants. The arrival of these first settlers would mark the end of an era and the beginning of a completely new chapter in New Zealand's story. The age of giant birds and pristine wilderness was coming to a close. The human story of New Zealand was about to begin. The canoes that approached New Zealand's shores carried more than just people. They brought with them the seeds of transformation that would reshape these islands forever. The Polynesian settlers, who would become known as the Māori, arrived with pigs, dogs, and most significantly, rats. But it wasn't just the animals they brought that would change everything. It was fire. Within decades of human arrival, roughly half of New Zealand's forests had vanished. The Māori used fire as a tool to clear land for agriculture and to flush out the massive moa birds for hunting. These controlled burns often spread beyond their intended boundaries, creating vast grasslands where once mighty forests had stood. The transformation was so rapid and complete that it ranks among the most dramatic human-caused environmental changes in Earth's history. The giant moa, those magnificent flightless birds that had roamed these islands for millions of years, faced their greatest challenge. These creatures, which had never encountered a land predator, had no fear of the small bipedal hunters that now stalked them through the forests. The largest species, standing taller than a grown man, provided enough meat to feed an entire village for weeks. Archaeological sites reveal the scale of this hunting. Massive bone beds where dozens of moa were processed, their bones carved into tools, their eggs turned into water containers. But the Māori weren't just hunters and destroyers. They were skilled adapters who developed a sophisticated culture perfectly suited to their new environment. They brought with them the sweet potato, or kumara, which became a cornerstone of their agricultural system. However, New Zealand's cooler climate meant that traditional Polynesian crops like taro and breadfruit couldn't survive. The Māori had to innovate, developing new cultivation techniques and storage methods to ensure their survival through the harsh winters. The absence of large land mammals meant that the Māori had to reimagine many aspects of Polynesian culture. Without pigs and chickens thriving in the cooler climate, they turned to the sea and to the native birds for protein. They became master hunters of seals and whales, developing techniques for taking down creatures many times their size. The abundance of marine life around New Zealand's extensive coastline provided a reliable food source that would sustain growing populations. As generations passed, distinct Māori tribes, or iwi, emerged across the islands. Each iwi developed its own territories, customs, and relationships with the land. The rugged geography of New Zealand, with its mountains, forests, and rivers, naturally divided these groups, leading to the development of different dialects and traditions. Some iwi became known as fierce warriors, others as skilled craftsmen or traders. The Māori developed a complex social structure that governed everything from resource management to warfare. Chiefs or rangatira led their people not through absolute power, but through mana, a concept that encompassed spiritual authority, respect, and proven leadership. This wasn't just political power. Mana connected leaders to the spiritual world and to the land itself. The relationship between Māori and the natural world was fundamentally different from European concepts of land ownership. To the Māori, land wasn't something to be possessed, but rather something to which they belonged. Every mountain, river, and forest had its own mori or life force. People were guardians, or kaitiaki, responsible for maintaining the balance between human needs and natural systems. This spiritual connection to the land shaped every aspect of Māori society. Wakapapa, the genealogical connections that linked families to ancestors and to the land itself, became the foundation of identity. These weren't just family trees. They were spiritual maps that connected living people to the creation stories of their world. The Māori developed remarkable artistic traditions that reflected their new environment. Their wood carvings, featuring intricate spirals and stylized human figures, adorned meeting houses that served as the spiritual and social centers of communities. These carvings weren't just decoration, they were history books, genealogies, and spiritual guides all carved into wood. Punamu, the greenstone found only in the South Island, became sacred to Māori culture. This hard, beautiful stone was carved into tools, weapons, and ornaments that held deep spiritual significance. The most prized pieces were passed down through generations, accumulating mana and history with each transfer. The Māori also developed a sophisticated oral tradition that preserved their history, laws, and spiritual beliefs across centuries. Without a written language, they created complex songs, stories, and chants that could accurately transmit information across generations. These weren't just stories. They were legal documents, historical records, and spiritual guides all wrapped into memorable verses. Warfare became a significant part of Māori culture, but it followed strict rules and protocols. Battles weren't fought for conquest in the European sense, but rather to maintain mana, settle disputes, or avenge insults. The elaborate pia, or fortified settlements, that dotted the landscape were engineering marvels that could house entire communities during times of conflict. The haka, the fierce war dance that would later become famous worldwide, served multiple purposes in Māori society. It was a way to intimidate enemies, to build unity among warriors, and to channel spiritual power before battle. But haka weren't just for war. There were haka for welcoming visitors, celebrating harvests, and marking important life events. Trade networks developed between different iwi, connecting communities across vast distances. Obsidian from volcanic regions was traded for paunamu from the south, while preserved foods moved between coastal and inland communities. These trade relationships weren't just economic, they were political and social connections that helped maintain peace and share resources. The Māori population grew and spread across both islands, adapting to different environments from the subtropical north to the alpine south. In the warmer northern regions, they could grow kumara and other crops more easily. In the cooler south, they relied more heavily on hunting and gathering, particularly the rich marine resources. By the time European explorers would first sight New Zealand's shores, the Māori had been shaping these islands for over 400 years. They had developed a sophisticated civilization that was perfectly adapted to their environment. Their population had grown to perhaps 100,000 people, living in communities from the far north to the deep south. But the Maori world was about to face another transformation, as dramatic as their own arrival had been for the giant birds and pristine forests. Somewhere in the vast Pacific, European ships were beginning to explore the ocean that the Polynesian ancestors of the Māori had mastered centuries before. The age of isolation was ending. Soon, these islands would be connected to a global network of trade, ideas, and conflict that would challenge everything the Maori had built. The next chapter of New Zealand's story would involve not just one people adapting to a new land, but two very different cultures learning to share the same islands. The stage was set for encounters that would reshape not just New Zealand, but the entire understanding of what it meant to be human in an interconnected world. The first European to lay eyes on New Zealand wasn't looking for these islands at all. Abel Tasman, a Dutch navigator sailing for the Dutch East India Company, was actually searching for a southern continent that geographers were convinced had to exist. According to the theories of the time, there had to be a massive landmass in the southern hemisphere to balance out all the land in the north. Without it, surely the earth would tip over. On December 13, 1642, Tasman's crew spotted what they described as a large land, uplifted high. They had found the west coast of what would later be called New Zealand's South Island. But this first encounter between Europeans and New Zealand would not go according to plan. Tasman anchored his ships in what is now Golden Bay and sent out a small boat to find fresh water and make contact with any inhabitants. What happened next would colour European perceptions of New Zealand for over a century. Maori warriors in waka, traditional war canoes, approached the Dutch vessels. The meeting was tense from the start, two completely different cultures trying to understand each other across a vast gulf of language, custom, and worldview. The Maori had their own protocols for encountering strangers. They issued a challenge, sounding their traditional war horns and performing haka to demonstrate their strength and test the intentions of these pale-skinned visitors. To the Dutch, these displays looked like naked aggression from savage warriors. The Europeans responded by firing their muskets into the air, a gesture they intended as a show of superior firepower. Neither side understood the other's signals. The Maori interpreted the gunfire as an act of war. The Dutch saw the approaching war canoes as an imminent attack. When Maori warriors killed 4 Dutch sailors in the ensuing chaos, Tasman decided these islands were too dangerous to explore further. He sailed away without ever setting foot on New Zealand soil, naming the place Staten Land after the Dutch Parliament. For the next 127 years, New Zealand remained largely forgotten by the European world. Tasman's reports described hostile natives and treacherous waters, hardly an invitation for further exploration. The Dutch were focused on their profitable spice trade in Indonesia and saw little reason to risk men and ships investigating these remote islands. But the age of Pacific exploration was just beginning. European powers were starting to realize that the Pacific Ocean held secrets and opportunities that could reshape global trade and power. The race was on to map, claim, and exploit the vast ocean that covered nearly half the Earth's surface. Into this environment stepped one of history's greatest navigators, Captain James Cook. Unlike Tasman, Cook wasn't just looking for land. He was on a scientific mission that would revolutionize European understanding of the Pacific. In 1769, he arrived in New Zealand waters aboard HMS Endeavour, carrying with him not just sailors and marines, but scientists, artists, and naturalists eager to document whatever they might find. Cook's first encounter with the Maori was almost as violent as Tasman's had been. When his ship anchored off the coast of what would later be called Poverty Bay, Maori warriors again approached to challenge the strangers. Cook's men, nervous and trigger-happy, shot and killed a Maori warrior during the first meeting. It was an inauspicious start that would haunt relations between Europeans and Maori for generations to come. But Cook was a different kind of explorer than Tasman. Rather than sailing away after the first violent encounter, he persisted in trying to establish peaceful contact with the Maori. Over the following months, he would circumnavigate both islands, creating the first accurate maps of New Zealand and establishing the foundation for all future European knowledge of these lands. The scientists aboard Cook's vessel were astounded by what they found. Joseph Banks, the expedition's chief naturalist, documented plants and animals unlike anything seen in Europe. The botanist Daniel Solander collected specimens that would revolutionize European understanding of plant geography. Sidney Parkinson, the expedition artist, created detailed drawings of Maori people, their customs, and their material culture. What emerged from Cook's voyages was a picture of New Zealand that fascinated European intellectuals. Here was a land of stunning natural beauty, inhabited by a people who seemed to represent humanity in its natural state. The Maori, with their complex tattoos, sophisticated art, and fierce warrior culture, became objects of intense curiosity for European philosophers trying to understand human nature and social development. Cook made 2 more voyages to New Zealand, each time learning more about the islands and their inhabitants. His detailed charts and favourable reports began to change European perceptions of these remote lands. Where Tasman had seen only danger, Cook saw opportunity. The harbours were excellent, the climate was temperate, and the natural resources seemed abundant. More importantly, Cook's voyages came at a time when European powers were desperately seeking new opportunities for expansion. Britain had just lost its American colonies in a costly revolution. The Industrial Revolution was creating demand for new raw materials and new markets. The Pacific suddenly looked like a vast ocean of possibilities, rather than just empty water. French explorers followed in Cook's wake, confirming his reports and adding their own observations. Marion Dufresne arrived in 1772 with plans to establish a French presence in New Zealand, but his expedition ended in disaster when he and 26 of his men were killed in a conflict with Maori in the Bay of Islands. The death sent shockwaves through European capitals and reinforced the image of New Zealand as a dangerous frontier. But these setbacks only seemed to increase European interest in New Zealand. The islands represented everything that European Enlightenment thinkers found fascinating about the wider world: exotic peoples, untapped natural resources, and the possibility of understanding humanity's development from savagery to civilization. The first Europeans to actually settle in New Zealand weren't explorers or colonists, but sealers and whalers drawn by the abundant marine life around the islands. These rough men established temporary camps along the coasts, hunting seals for their valuable fur and whales for their oil. They lived harsh, dangerous lives on the very edges of the known world. These early sealers and whalers were the first Europeans to develop ongoing relationships with Maori communities. Unlike the brief encounters of the explorers, these men needed to trade with local iwi for food, shelter, and safety. They learned basic Maori language, adopted some Maori customs, and often took Maori wives. Some abandoned European life entirely, becoming absorbed into Maori society. The sealers in particular had a devastating impact on New Zealand's marine ecosystems. Within decades, they had hunted fur seals to the brink of extinction around the main islands. Entire colonies that had existed for thousands of years were wiped out in just a few seasons. The sealers then moved on to more remote islands, continuing their relentless harvest until there were simply no more seals left to kill. The whaling industry followed a similar pattern, but lasted longer, due to the vast numbers of whales that migrated through New Zealand waters. Shore-based whaling stations were established around both islands, bringing the first permanent European settlements to New Zealand. These stations became crucial meeting points between European and Maori cultures. Maori quickly recognized the value of European technology and goods. Metal tools, muskets, blankets, and other manufactured items offered significant advantages over traditional materials. But the Maori weren't passive recipients of European technology. They were selective, adaptive, and strategic in how they incorporated new tools and ideas into their existing culture. The introduction of muskets had particularly dramatic consequences for Maori society. Some iwi gained access to firearms through trade with Europeans, while others remained armed only with traditional weapons. This technological imbalance triggered a period of devastating warfare known as the Musket Wars that would reshape Maori society and dramatically reduce the Maori population. The Musket Wars began around 1807 and continued for nearly 4 decades. Iwi with access to muskets launched devastating raids against traditional enemies who could only respond with clubs, spears, and traditional tactics. The warfare was unlike anything in previous Maori history. Entire populations were displaced, traditional territories were conquered, and the delicate balance of power between different iwi was completely disrupted. Hongi Hika, a chief from the Ngapuhi iwi in the far north, became one of the most feared leaders of this period. He travelled to England in 1820, meeting King George IV and studying European military tactics. When he returned to New Zealand, he used his new knowledge and his access to muskets to launch campaigns that reached as far south as Wellington. His raids killed thousands and displaced entire tribes from their traditional lands. The violence of the Musket Wars shocked European observers and reinforced stereotypes about Maori savagery. But what these observers failed to understand was that the wars were largely a consequence of European contact itself. The uneven distribution of European technology had destabilized a society that had developed sophisticated ways of managing conflict over centuries. As the Musket Wars raged, a new type of European began arriving in New Zealand. Missionaries determined to bring Christianity to the Maori. The first mission station was established in the Bay of Islands in 1814 by Samuel Marsden, an Anglican chaplain from Australia. These missionaries brought with them not just religious ideas, but also European concepts of agriculture, education, and social organisation. The relationship between missionaries and Maori was complex and often contradictory. The missionaries were appalled by what they saw as Maori savagery, the warfare, the cannibalism, and the polygamy. But they were also impressed by Maori intelligence, artistic ability, and social sophistication. Many missionaries learned Maori language and customs far better than any previous Europeans. The missionaries' greatest achievement was the development of a written form of the Maori language. Using the Roman alphabet, they created a phonetic system that allowed Maori oral traditions to be recorded for the first time. The Bible was translated into Maori, and literacy spread rapidly through Maori communities. Within a few decades, Maori had higher literacy rates than many European populations. But literacy was a double-edged gift. While it allowed Maori to preserve their traditions in new ways, it also exposed them to European ideas about land ownership, individual rights, and social organisation that would prove deeply disruptive to traditional Maori society. By the 1830s, New Zealand was becoming increasingly integrated into global networks of trade and communication. European ships regularly visited New Zealand ports. Maori travelled to Australia and even to Europe. Trade goods flowed in both directions, with Maori exporting flax, timber, and preserved foods in exchange for metal tools, textiles, and firearms. This growing integration brought both opportunities and problems. Maori communities that successfully adapted to the new trading relationships prospered and grew in power. But the increasing European presence also brought disease, social disruption, and pressure on traditional ways of life. The stage was set for the next major transformation in New Zealand's history. European powers were beginning to take a more systematic interest in Pacific colonization. The success of Australian settlements had demonstrated that European societies could thrive in the Southern Hemisphere. New Zealand, with its temperate climate and apparent abundance of land, was beginning to look like the next logical target for colonial expansion. But unlike Australia, New Zealand already had a substantial indigenous population with sophisticated social and political systems. The question of how European colonization would proceed in a land already occupied by the Maori would define the next chapter of New Zealand's story and create conflicts and controversies that continue to this day. The pressure for organised European colonisation of New Zealand was building throughout the 1830s, like steam in a boiler ready to explode. In Britain, social reformers and entrepreneurs were looking for new opportunities to create ideal societies free from the industrial squalor and class conflicts that plagued the homeland. New Zealand, with its temperate climate and seemingly endless stretches of fertile land, appeared to offer the perfect canvas for their utopian dreams. Edward Gibbon. Wakefield, a controversial figure who had spent time in prison for abducting an heiress, emerged as the most influential advocate for systematic colonisation. Wakefield had radical ideas about how colonies should be established. Rather than the haphazard settlement that had characterised places like Australia, he proposed carefully planned communities where land would be sold at sufficient prices to ensure that only respectable settlers could afford it, while the revenue would fund the passage of working-class labourers. The New Zealand Company, formed by Wakefield and his associates, didn't wait for government approval to begin their colonisation scheme. In 1839, they dispatched ships to New Zealand with instructions to purchase land from the Māori and establish settlements before any rival colonisation efforts could gain a foothold. This private colonisation venture would force the British government's hand and accelerate the formal annexation of New Zealand. But there was a problem with Wakefield's grand plan. He had never actually been to New Zealand. His knowledge of the islands came entirely from Cook's journals and the reports of missionaries and traders. He had no real understanding of Maori society, no grasp of the complex relationships between different iwi, and no appreciation for the difficulties of establishing European-style agriculture in a land so different from Britain. The first New Zealand company ship, the Tory, arrived in Wellington Harbour in September 1839. William Wakefield, Edward's brother, was tasked with purchasing land from local Maori chiefs. These negotiations revealed the vast cultural gulf between European and Maori concepts of land ownership. To the Maori, land wasn't a commodity to be bought and sold, but rather a spiritual inheritance that connected them to their ancestors and defined their identity. The Maori chiefs who met with William Wakefield thought they were granting permission for the Europeans to use certain areas of land, much as they might allow another iwi to fish in their waters or gather food in their forests. They couldn't conceive of permanently alienating land from their people. The Europeans, meanwhile, believed they were purchasing absolute ownership that would allow them to exclude the original inhabitants entirely. These fundamental misunderstandings set the stage for decades of conflict and controversy. The New Zealand Company claimed to have purchased millions of acres of land for a few £100 worth of trade goods. The Maori believed they had granted temporary use rights while maintaining their spiritual and practical connections to the land. Both sides operated according to their own cultural logic, but neither truly understood what the other meant. As more ships arrived carrying hundreds of eager settlers, the reality of colonisation began to clash with Wakefield's theoretical plans. The settlers found a landscape very different from the rolling green fields they had expected. Much of the land the company claimed to have purchased was still covered in dense forests that would take years to clear. Other areas were swampy or mountainous, unsuitable for the intensive agriculture that was supposed to make the colony profitable. Worse still, many of the areas where settlers were supposed to establish their new communities were already occupied by thriving Maori villages. The Maori had no intention of abandoning their homes and gardens, just because some to have purchased the Europeans' claim land from distant chiefs. Conflicts erupted almost immediately, as confused settlers tried to establish farms on land that the Maori considered their own. The British government watched these developments with growing alarm. Private colonisation was creating exactly the kind of chaotic situation that official policy was supposed to prevent. Reports of conflicts between settlers and Maori, disputes over land ownership, and the general lawlessness of the emerging settlements convinced London that direct government intervention was necessary. Captain William Hobson was dispatched from Australia with instructions to negotiate a treaty with the Maori chiefs that would establish British sovereignty over New Zealand while protecting Maori rights and interests. Hobson was an experienced naval officer, but he had no background in diplomacy and little understanding of Maori culture. The task before him was monumentally complex. To somehow reconcile European desires for land and sovereignty with Maori expectations of maintaining their autonomy and spiritual connection to the land. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Waitangi began in February 1840 at the British Residency in the Bay of Islands. Hobson was advised by James Busby, the British resident, who had been unsuccessfully trying to maintain order in New Zealand for several years, and by Henry Williams, the head of the Church Missionary Society, who had learned to speak Maori fluently. The treaty document itself was hastily drafted and contained fundamental ambiguities that would cause problems for generations. The English version Maori C spoke of ceding sovereignty to Queen Victoria while retaining possession of their lands, forests, and fisheries. But the Maori version, translated by Henry Williams, used words that conveyed very different meanings. The Maori word kawanatanga, used to translate sovereignty, was a new term that Williams had invented to describe the governor's authority. Most Maori understood this to mean that they were granting the British the right to control European settlers, not that they were giving up their own authority over their people and lands. The concept of absolute sovereignty, fundamental to European political thought, simply didn't exist. Similarly, in Maori society, the treaty promised to protect Maori rangatiratanga, which was translated as chieftainship in English, but meant much more to the Maori. Rangatiratanga encompassed not just political authority, but spiritual mana, cultural practices, and the complex relationships between people and land that defined Maori society. The Maori chiefs who signed the treaty believed they were retaining their essential authority while gaining British protection from lawless Europeans. On February 6, 1840, about 40 Māori chiefs gathered at Waitangi to hear Hobson explain the treaty. The discussions were heated and continued for several days. Some chiefs, particularly those who had developed close relationships with missionaries, supported the treaty as a way to bring law and order to their dealings with Europeans. Others were deeply suspicious of European intentions and worried about losing their independence. Hona Heki, a powerful northern chief, initially refused to sign, declaring that he would not accept Queen Victoria as his sovereign. But, eventually, the persuasion of the missionaries and other chiefs his name convinced him to a document. His signature would prove to be one of the most consequential in New Zealand history, as he would later lead the first organised Maori resistance to British rule. The treaty signing at Waitangi was just the beginning. Hobson and his officials spent the following months travelling around both islands, seeking signatures from as many chiefs as possible. Different copies of the treaty were used, and the circumstances of signing varied greatly. Some chiefs signed enthusiastically after careful consideration. Others were pressured or misled, and still others signed versions of the treaty that differed from the original. By the end of 1840, Hobson claimed that enough chiefs had signed to establish British sovereignty over all of New Zealand. Queen Victoria was proclaimed sovereign, and New Zealand officially became a British colony. But the reality on the ground was far more complex than this legal declaration suggested. Many powerful chiefs had refused to sign the treaty, particularly regions where European settlement was still minimal. These chiefs maintained that they had never surrendered their sovereignty and would resist any attempts by the British government to impose its authority over them. Even among those who had signed, there were vastly different understandings of what the treaty actually meant. The immediate impact of the treaty was to accelerate European immigration to New Zealand. Word spread throughout Britain and Australia that New Zealand was now a safe, legal destination for settlers seeking new opportunities. The New Zealand Company intensified its recruitment efforts, promising cheap land and prosperous futures to anyone willing to make the journey to the other side of the world. Ships began arriving regularly in Wellington, New Plymouth, Nelson, and other planned settlements, each carrying hundreds of hopeful colonists, These weren't the convicts and desperados who had initially populated Australia, but respectable middle-class families seeking to improve their circumstances. They brought with them European expectations about law, property rights, and social organisation that would prove difficult to reconcile with existing Maori society. The colonial government, based initially in Auckland, struggled to manage this rapid influx of settlers, while also fulfilling its treaty obligations to protect Maori interests. Land disputes multiplied as settlers discovered that the areas they had been promised were still occupied by Maori communities who had no intention of moving. The government found itself caught between angry settlers demanding the land they believed they had purchased and Maori chiefs insisting on their treaty rights. Governor Hobson, overwhelmed by the scale of the problems facing the new colony, suffered a series of strokes and died in 1842, just 2 years after the treaty signing. His successor, Robert Fitzroy, inherited a colony on the verge of financial collapse and racial war. The New Zealand Company was running out of money. Settlers were threatening rebellion over land disputes, and Maori chiefs were growing increasingly hostile to British authority. Fitzroy attempted to resolve the crisis by recognising some Maori land sales that had occurred before the treaty, hoping to satisfy both settlers and Maori. But this policy pleased no one. Settlers complained that they were being forced to pay twice for land they thought they already owned, while Maori argued that the government was legitimising fraudulent purchases made without proper authority. The situation exploded into open conflict in 1845 when Hone Hiki, one of the original signatories of the Treaty of Waitangi, cut down the British flagstaff at Flagstaff Hill near Russell. For Hiki, the flagstaff had become a symbol of British sovereignty that he could no longer tolerate. His actions sparked the Northern War, the first of a series of conflicts that would collectively become known as the New Zealand Wars. The Northern War revealed the limitations of British military power in New Zealand's difficult terrain. Heke and his ally Kawiti constructed a revolutionary new type of fortification that combined traditional Māori pa design with innovations specifically designed to counter European muskets and artillery. These modern PA featured underground bunkers, complex trench systems, and carefully designed fields of fire that neutralized many of the technological advantages that Europeans had previously enjoyed. British forces, trained for European-style warfare, struggled to cope with Maori guerrilla tactics and innovative fortifications. The war dragged on for months, with the British suffering a series of humiliating defeats, despite their superior numbers and firepower. The conflict only ended when Heke and Kawiti, having made their point about Maori military capabilities, chose to negotiate a peace that left fundamental questions about sovereignty unresolved. The Northern War sent shockwaves through both the colonial government and Maori society. For the British, it demonstrated that imposing their authority over New Zealand would be far more difficult and expensive than they had anticipated. For the Maori, it proved that European military technology could be countered through innovation and tactical skill, but it also revealed the devastating impact that modern warfare would have on their communities. As news of the conflict reached Britain, critics of New Zealand colonization argued that the colony was becoming a costly burden that drained British resources without providing adequate returns. Supporters countered that the colony's problems stemmed from inadequate government support, and that proper investment would create a prosperous settlement that would benefit the empire. The debate over New Zealand's future took place against the backdrop of broader changes in British colonial policy. The success of responsible government in Canada had demonstrated that colonies could be granted substantial self-governance while remaining within the British Empire. Reformers argued that New Zealand's problems could be solved by giving settlers more control over their own affairs, while opponents worried that colonial self-government would lead to the oppression of indigenous peoples. These political debates in London would have profound consequences for New Zealand's development. The decisions made in British Parliament about colonial governance, land policy, and indigenous rights would shape the trajectory of New Zealand society for generations to come. The stage was set for even greater conflicts as European settlement expanded and Maori resistance intensified. The small British colony clinging to the edges of these vast Pacific islands was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether European and Maori societies could coexist, or whether one would ultimately dominate the other. The answers to these questions would emerge not from diplomatic negotiations or parliamentary debates, but from the harsh realities of frontier conflict and cultural collision. The solution to New Zealand's mounting crises came in the form of a man who would transform the colony more dramatically than any single individual in its history. George Grey arrived as governor in 1845, stepping off the ship into a colony teetering on the brink of collapse. At just 33 years old, Grey brought with him an unusual combination of military experience, intellectual curiosity, and administrative skill that would prove exactly what New Zealand needed. Grey's approach to governing New Zealand was revolutionary for its time. Rather than simply imposing British authority through force, he made a genuine effort to understand Maori culture and language. He studied Maori customs, learned to speak the language fluently, and even collected and published Maori myths and legends. This wasn't just academic interest. Grey understood that effective governance required understanding the people he was trying to govern. But Grey was no romantic idealist. He combined his cultural sensitivity with ruthless pragmatism when dealing with threats to colonial authority. When conflicts arose, he responded with overwhelming force designed to end resistance quickly and decisively. His strategy was to demonstrate that rebellion was futile while offering generous terms to those who accepted British rule. The transformation under Grey's leadership was remarkable. The colonial government's finances stabilised as he negotiated better terms with the British Treasury and implemented more efficient taxation systems. Immigration resumed as word spread that New Zealand was finally becoming a safe destination for settlers. Most importantly, a fragile peace was established between European settlers and most Maori communities. Grey's land policies attempted to balance settler demands with Maori rights, though the results were mixed. He established a more for investigating land claims and purchasing systematic process Maori land, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. European settlers wanted individual ownership of large blocks of land for farming, while Maori understood land in terms of collective spiritual and practical relationships that couldn't be simply bought and sold. The discovery of gold in Otago in 1861 transformed New Zealand's economy overnight. News of the gold strike spread rapidly across the Tasman Sea to the Australian goldfields, where experienced miners immediately recognised the opportunity. Ships packed with fortune seekers began arriving in Dunedin, transforming a quiet Scottish Presbyterian settlement into a booming frontier town almost overnight. The gold rush brought a level of prosperity to New Zealand that few had imagined possible. The population exploded as miners, merchants and entrepreneurs flocked to the goldfields. Towns sprang up in remote valleys that had never seen European settlement. The colonial government suddenly found itself flush with revenue from miners' licenses and taxes on gold exports. But the gold rush also intensified pressure on Maori land. Mining required access to river valleys and mountain ranges that were sacred to local iwi. The government found itself caught between the demands of gold-hungry miners and the rights of Maori landowners who had no interest in allowing their ancestral territories to be torn apart by European prospectors. The wealth generated by gold also changed the character of New Zealand society. The rough egalitarianism of the goldfields challenged the class distinctions that the New Zealand Company had tried to establish. A miner who struck it rich could buy land and social position regardless of his background. The Presbyterian sobriety of the Otago settlers was challenged by the hard-drinking, gambling culture of the goldfields. Chinese miners began arriving in significant numbers during the later phases of the gold rush, adding another layer of complexity to New Zealand's developing multicultural society. These Chinese immigrants faced significant discrimination from European miners, who saw them as unfair competition. but they proved remarkably successful at working claims that others had abandoned and establishing market gardens and businesses that served the mining communities. The social transformations brought by the gold rush extended far beyond the goldfields themselves. The sudden wealth and rapid population growth created demand for everything from basic supplies to luxury goods. Merchants in Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch prospered as they supplied the goldfields. Farmers found ready markets for their produce among mining communities that had no time to grow their own food. The gold rush also accelerated New Zealand's political development. The Colonial Government Act of 1852 had granted New Zealand a form of representative government, but the small settler population meant that political power remained concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy landowners and merchants. The gold rush brought thousands of new settlers who demanded a voice in colonial politics. These new immigrants weren't content to be governed by the established colonial elite. They demanded expanded voting rights, more representative electoral districts, and policies that favoured small farmers and working men over large landowners. The political tensions that emerged from these conflicts would shape New Zealand politics for generations to come. Meanwhile, Māori society was undergoing its own transformation in response to European settlement. The disruptions of the Musket Wars had already shaken traditional social structures, and the growing European presence created new challenges and opportunities that required innovative responses. Some Maori leaders embraced European technology and agricultural methods, using them to strengthen their traditional authority. They established flour mills, shipped produce to Australian markets, and employed European techniques to increase the productivity of their lands. These progressive chiefs demonstrated that Maori could adapt to the modern world without abandoning their cultural identity. But other Maori leaders viewed European influence with growing alarm. They saw their people adopting European customs, their young people abandoning traditional ways, and their land being steadily alienated to European settlers. The missions had created a generation of literate Maori who could read European newspapers and understand exactly what was happening to indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, had an unexpected impact on New Zealand. Cotton shortages caused by the war created sudden demand for alternative fibres, and New Zealand flax became a valuable export commodity. Maori, who had been harvesting and processing flax for centuries, found themselves with a profitable industry that didn't require alienating their land to Europeans. The flax trade created a new form of economic relationship between Maori and Europeans. Maori communities could participate in the global economy while maintaining control over their traditional resources. Some iwi became wealthy through flax trading, using their profits to purchase European goods and technology while maintaining their political and cultural autonomy. But the success of some Maori in adapting to the European economy also created new tensions within Maori society. Traditional chiefs found their authority challenged by successful traders and entrepreneurs who derived their influence from wealth rather than hereditary status. The social structures that had governed Maori society for centuries were being reshaped by contact with European commercial systems. The rapid changes transforming New Zealand society created a complex web of relationships between different groups with conflicting interests. European settlers demanded more land and greater political representation. Maori communities struggled to maintain their autonomy while adapting to European technology and economic systems. The colonial government tried to balance these competing demands while maintaining order and promoting economic development. Religious movements began emerging within Maori society that attempted to address these tensions by combining Christian and traditional Maori beliefs. The most significant of these was the Pai Marire movement, founded by Te Wā Haumene in Taranaki. This syncretic religion promised that its followers would be protected from European bullets and that the Europeans would eventually be driven from New Zealand. Pai Marire spread rapidly through Maori communities that were feeling pressure from European settlement. The movement's promise of spiritual protection from European technology appealed to Māori, who felt overwhelmed by the pace of change in their society. But the movement also alarmed colonial authorities who saw it as a threat to public order and European settlement. The tensions between different visions of New Zealand's future were building toward another major crisis. European settlers, emboldened by their growing numbers and economic success, were demanding greater access to Maori land and more aggressive government policies to promote development. Maori communities were accommodation increasingly divided between those who saw with Europeans as the path to survival and those who believed that resistance was necessary to preserve their cultural identity. The discovery of gold had brought prosperity and population growth, but it had also intensified the fundamental conflicts that had been present since the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. The question of whether New Zealand would develop as a bicultural society respecting both European and Maori rights, or whether European settlement would ultimately overwhelm indigenous society, remained unresolved. The stage was set for the largest and most devastating conflicts in New Zealand's history. The wars that were about to engulf the North Island would determine not just the immediate question of who would control the land, but the long-term character of New Zealand society. The decisions made in the heat of battle and the aftermath of a war would create patterns of racial relationship that would influence New Zealand for more than a century. In Taranaki, a dispute over a single piece of land was about to ignite a conflict that would spread across the North Island and fundamentally reshape the relationship between Maori and European New Zealanders. The Waitara Purchase, as it would become known, seemed like a minor land transaction to colonial officials, but to the Maori involved, it represented everything that was wrong with European approaches to land ownership and indigenous rights. Te Teira, a minor chief from the Atiawa iwi, had approached the colonial government offering to sell land at Waitara. Governor Thomas Gore Brown saw this as an opportunity to establish the principle that individual Maori could sell land without the consent of their wider community. But Wiremu Kungi, the principal chief of the area, absolutely refused to allow the sale, arguing that Te Teira had no right to alienate land that belonged to the entire community. The dispute revealed fundamental differences between European and Maori concepts of authority and land ownership that the Treaty of Waitangi had failed to resolve. European law recognized individual property rights and the authority of government to enforce contracts. Maori custom required collective decision-making about land and recognized the authority of principal chiefs to veto transactions that would harm the community. Governor Brown decided to force the issue. In March 1860, government surveyors began marking out the disputed land under military protection. Wiremu Kungi's supporters built a defensive position to prevent the survey and declared that they would resist any attempt to take the land by force. The colonial government responded by proclaiming martial law and calling up military forces to enforce the purchase. The Taranaki War that followed was unlike the earlier conflicts between Maori and European forces. This wasn't a localized dispute between a few chiefs and colonial authorities, but a systematic attempt by the government to establish its authority over Maori land ownership throughout the colony. The stakes were enormous. Success would open up vast areas of the North Island to European settlement, while failure would essentially concede that Maori retained sovereignty over their traditional territories. The military campaigns revealed how much both sides had learned from earlier conflicts. The colonial forces were larger and better equipped than in previous wars, but they still struggled against innovative Maori defensive tactics. Maori engineering had continued to evolve, producing fortifications that were virtually impregnable to direct assault, but could be abandoned quickly when circumstances required tactical withdrawal. The war also demonstrated the growing sophistication of Maori political organisation. Wiremu Kungi received support from iwi across the North Island, who recognised that the Waitara dispute threatened all Maori land rights. Warriors travelled hundreds of kilometres to join the resistance, creating a coalition that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. But the most significant development was the emergence of the Kungitanga, or Maori King movement, which attempted to create a unified Maori government that could negotiate with the colonial authorities as an equal. The movement crowned Potatau Te Werowero as the first Maori king in 1858, establishing a parallel government structure that claimed sovereignty over much of the North Island. The Kangitanga represented a sophisticated response to the challenges posed by European colonization. Rather than simply resisting European influence, the movement attempted to adapt European political concepts to Maori purposes. The idea was to create a unified Maori state that could protect indigenous land and culture while engaging with the modern world on equal terms. Colonial authorities viewed the Kangitanga as a direct challenge to British sovereignty that could not be tolerated. The existence of an alternative government claiming authority over large areas of the colony threatened the entire colonial project. If Maori could successfully establish their own state, it would effectively partition New Zealand and limit European settlement to the areas where the colonial government could enforce its authority. The conflict escalated when Kangitanga forces began supporting the Taranaki resistance. What had begun as a localized land dispute was transforming into a war for control of the North Island. The colonial government found itself fighting not just isolated groups of Maori warriors, but an organized indigenous state with its own military forces, political structure, and territorial claims. The Waikato War, which began in 1863, was the largest military campaign in New Zealand history. Colonial forces, supported by British imperial troops, invaded the Waikato region with the explicit goal of destroying the Kangitanga and confiscating the land of all Maori who had supported the King movement. This wasn't just a military campaign, but an attempt at systematic conquest designed to break Maori resistance permanently. The scale of the military operations was unprecedented. The colonial government assembled over 20,000 troops, including British regulars, colonial volunteers, and friendly Maori allies. They constructed roads and military settlements to support their advance into the heart of the King country. The campaign required massive resources and represented the largest military commitment that Britain had made to any colonial war since the American Revolution. Maori resistance was equally determined and well organized. The Kangitanga forces constructed a series of sophisticated fortifications along the Waikato River, each designed to delay the colonial advance and inflict maximum casualties. They employed guerrilla tactics that had been refined through decades of warfare, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to harass colonial supply lines and communications. The war also revealed the international dimensions of the New Zealand conflicts. Maori leaders were aware of events in other parts of the world where indigenous peoples were resisting European colonization. Some sought to establish diplomatic relationships with other nations, hoping to gain recognition for Maori sovereignty and possibly military support for their resistance. The colonial government, meanwhile, was acutely aware that the eyes of the world were watching their handling of the indigenous population. Critics in Britain and elsewhere were beginning to question the morality of colonial wars against indigenous peoples. The government needed to present their military campaigns as necessary for law and order rather than simple conquest. The battles of the Waikato War were some of the bloodiest in New Zealand history. At Rangiriri, Maori defenders fought to the last man in their trenches rather than surrender. At Orokau, a mixed force of Maori men, women, and children held off colonial attacks for 3 days before attempting a desperate breakout that ended in massacre. But the superior resources of the colonial forces eventually told. Maori resistance was ground down by the relentless advance of well-supplied troops supported by artillery and steamships. The Kangitanga forces were pushed back into the remote interior of the North Island, their political structure disrupted, and their economic base destroyed. The aftermath of the Waikato War was as significant as the conflict itself. The colonial government confiscated over 1.6 million hectares of land from Maori, who had supported the King movement or been deemed rebels. This massive land confiscation, known as raupatu, was designed not just to punish resistance, but to provide land for European settlement and break up large blocks of Maori territory. The confiscations had devastating long-term consequences for Maori society. Entire iwi were dispossessed of their ancestral lands and forced to relocate to marginal areas unsuitable for traditional agriculture. The economic base that had supported Maori communities for centuries was destroyed, creating poverty and social disruption that would persist for generations. But the wars also had unexpected consequences for European New Zealand society. The massive military expenditure had nearly bankrupted the colonial government, demonstrating the costs of using force to resolve racial conflicts. The brutality of some military operations had shocked many European settlers who had not anticipated the level of violence that conquest would require. The end of the major military campaigns didn't bring peace, but rather a transformation of the conflict into different forms. Maori resistance continued through political organization, legal challenges, and occasional armed resistance. The colonial government had won the military war, but the struggle for control of New Zealand's future was far from over. The victory of colonial forces in the Waikato War marked a turning point that would reshape New Zealand society in ways that few could have anticipated. While the government had successfully crushed organised Maori resistance and confiscated vast tracts of land, the human and economic costs of the conflict had been staggering. The colonial treasury was virtually empty. Thousands of lives had been lost on both sides, and the social fabric of the entire country had been torn apart. In the immediate aftermath of the wars, European settlers poured into the newly available lands with an enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy. The confiscated territories in Taranaki and the Waikato represented some of the most fertile agricultural land in the North Island. Dairy farming, which had previously been limited to small-scale operations, suddenly became viable on an industrial scale. The lush pastures that had once supported Maori communities now grazed imported cattle and sheep, transforming the landscape and the economy. But the transition wasn't as smooth as colonial planners had hoped. Much of the confiscated land was still covered in dense forest that would take years to clear. The government, desperate to encourage settlement and generate revenue, sold land to speculators who had no intention of actually farming it themselves. These land sharks, as they became known, bought huge blocks at cheap prices and then subdivided them for resale to genuine settlers at enormous profits. The social consequences of this land speculation were profound. Many genuine settlers found themselves paying inflated prices for marginal land, while the best territories remained in the hands of absentee landlords. This created a pattern of land concentration that would influence New Zealand agriculture for decades to come. Large estates dominated the best farming areas, while small settlers were pushed onto inferior land or forced to work as labourers for wealthy landowners. Meanwhile, the displaced Maori communities faced an entirely different set of challenges. Those who had been driven from their traditional territories found themselves crowded onto reserves that were often too small and too poor to support their populations. The traditional economy based on fishing, hunting, and shifting cultivation was impossible in these confined spaces. Many Maori were forced to seek wage labour on the very farms that had been established on their former lands. The psychological impact of dispossession was perhaps even more devastating than the economic consequences. For people whose entire identity was bound up with specific places and landscapes, being separated from ancestral lands was a form of spiritual death. The wakapapa that connected families to their origins became broken narratives pointing to places they could no longer call home. Yet Maori communities demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to these impossible circumstances. New forms of leadership emerged as traditional chiefs found their authority undermined by the loss of land and resources. Educated Maori who could navigate both European and Maori worlds became increasingly important as intermediaries and advocates for their people. The emergence of Maori politicians like Wi Tako Ngatata and Weremu Tamihana represented a new strategy for protecting Maori interests. Rather than continuing armed resistance, these leaders attempted to work within the European political system to secure justice for their people. They learned English law, studied parliamentary procedure, and lobbied for compensation and land rights through legal and political channels. This political engagement was facilitated by the establishment of Māori electoral seats in 1867. The creation of 4 separate Māori constituencies was intended as a temporary measure to give Māori a voice in Parliament while they adapted to European-style democracy. But the separate representation also institutionalised racial divisions in New Zealand politics, creating a parallel system that would persist for more than a century. The first Māori members of Parliament faced enormous challenges in representing their constituents' interests. They were outnumbered by European members who often had little sympathy for Māori concerns. The parliamentary system itself was alien to Māori traditions of consensus decision-making and collective leadership. Yet these pioneering politicians gradually learned to use European political tools to advance Māori causes. The economic transformation of New Zealand accelerated dramatically during the 1870s, as new technologies and global market connections created unprecedented opportunities. The development of refrigerated shipping in 1882 revolutionised New Zealand agriculture by opening up British markets for meat and dairy products. Suddenly, New Zealand farmers could export perishable goods to the other side of the world, transforming the colony from a subsistence economy to a major food producer. The impact of refrigerated shipping cannot be overstated. It created a direct economic link between New Zealand pastures and British dinner tables that would define the country's economy for the next century. Farmers who had previously struggled to make a living from local markets suddenly found themselves part of a global food system that rewarded efficiency and scale. This agricultural revolution required massive infrastructure development. Railways snaked across both islands, connecting farming districts to ports where refrigerated ships waited to carry their cargo to distant markets. Telegraph lines followed the railway routes, allowing farmers and merchants to communicate instantly with markets on the other side of the world. The entire landscape was being reorganized around the demands of export agriculture. The social implications of this economic transformation were equally dramatic. The prosperity generated by agricultural exports created a new middle class of successful farmers and rural businessmen. These agricultural entrepreneurs often came from humble backgrounds, but found themselves wealthy enough to build substantial homes, educate their children, and participate in the political life of the colony. But the benefits of agricultural prosperity weren't equally shared. Māori communities, already marginalised by land confiscations, found themselves largely excluded from the new economy. Most lacked access to the capital needed to establish commercial farming operations, and much of their remaining land was unsuitable for the intensive pastoral agriculture that the export markets demanded. The few Māori who did manage to establish successful commercial operations often faced discrimination from European buyers and shippers who preferred to deal with their own kind. Māori farmers might produce crops of equal quality, but they struggled to access the networks of credit, marketing, and transportation that European farmers took for granted. Immigration from Britain accelerated as word spread about New Zealand's economic opportunities. The assisted immigration schemes brought thousands of working-class families seeking better lives in the colonies. These weren't the wealthy investors that the New Zealand company had originally targeted, but ordinary people hoping that hard work in a new country would provide opportunities unavailable in the industrial cities of Britain. The character of New Zealand society began to change as these new immigrants brought different values and expectations. Many came from backgrounds where land ownership was impossible for ordinary people. The possibility of owning their own farms represented a social revolution that challenged traditional British class structures. These immigrants also brought new political ideas that would reshape New Zealand democracy. Many had been influenced by radical movements in Britain that advocated for workers' rights, women's suffrage, and social reform. They saw New Zealand as an opportunity to build a more egalitarian society, free from the class divisions and social problems of the old world. The Liberal government that came to power in 1891 embodied many of these reformist ideals. Under the leadership of John Balance and later Richard Seddon, the Liberals implemented a series of progressive policies that made New Zealand one of the most advanced democracies in the world. They broke up large estates to provide land for small farmers, introduced old age pensions, and regulated working conditions in factories. Most dramatically, New Zealand became the first country in the world to grant women the right to vote in 1893. The suffrage campaign had been building for years, led by determined women like Kate Shepherd, who organised petitions, public meetings, and political pressure that eventually overcame conservative opposition. The success of the women's suffrage movement established New Zealand's reputation as a progressive society, willing to experiment with social reform. But even these progressive reforms had complex implications for Māori communities. The liberal land policies that broke up large European estates often ignored Māori land rights entirely. The communal ownership systems that governed most remaining Māori land were seen as obstacles to development that needed to be replaced with individual title systems that would allow for market transactions. The Native Land Court, established in 1862 but expanded significantly during the Liberal era, became the mechanism for transforming Māori land tenure. This court had the power to investigate traditional ownership and issue individual titles that could be bought and sold like European property. The process was supposed to protect Māori land rights while making development possible, but in practice, it often resulted in further land loss. The court proceedings were conducted in English according to European legal procedures that most Māori didn't understand. Traditional collective ownership was replaced with individual titles that could be sold without the consent of the wider community. Entrepreneurial Europeans quickly learned to exploit the system, purchasing individual shares in Māori land blocks until they gained control of entire properties. The consequences of these land policies were devastating for many Māori communities. By the end of the 19th century, Māori retained control of only about 11 million acres of their original territory, and much of this was marginal land unsuitable for commercial agriculture. The economic base that might have allowed Māori communities to participate in New Zealand's growing prosperity had been systematically eroded. Yet Māori communities continued to adapt and survive despite these overwhelming challenges. New forms of cultural expression emerged that combined traditional elements with influences from the wider world. The development of modern haka, traditional songs, and carving styles reflected both cultural continuity and creative adaptation to changing circumstances. Religious movements also provided ways for Māori communities to maintain their identity while engaging with the modern world. The Ringatu Church, founded by Te Kutiariki Te Turuki after his dramatic escape from the Chatham Islands, combined Christian and traditional Māori elements in ways that provided spiritual comfort and cultural affirmation for its followers. Educational initiatives began to emerge as Māori leaders recognized that their people needed new skills to survive in the changing established schools that taught both world. Some traditional knowledge and European subjects. Others sent promising young people to European schools and universities, hoping they would return to lead their communities into the 20th century. The discovery of gold in the west coast of the South Island during the 1860s created another economic boom that further transformed New Zealand society. Unlike the Otago goldfields, which had attracted primarily Australian miners, the West Coast drew prospectors from around the world. The population of the region exploded from virtually zero to over 40,000 in just a few years. The West Coast goldfields were different from earlier gold discoveries in their scale and duration. While most alluvial gold deposits were quickly exhausted, the West Coast rivers continued to produce gold for decades. This created permanent mining communities rather than the temporary camps that characterized other gold fields. The social character of the West Coast was shaped by its isolation and the dangerous nature of mining work. Cut off from the rest of New Zealand by the Southern Alps, West Coast communities developed their own distinct culture that combined elements from the many nationalities represented among the miners. Irish, Scottish, English, Australian, Chinese, and other immigrant groups created a multicultural society unlike anywhere else in New Zealand. The Chinese miners who came to the West Coast faced particular challenges from racial prejudice and discriminatory legislation. The government imposed special taxes on Chinese immigrants and restricted their rights in various ways. Despite these obstacles, Chinese miners often proved more successful than their European counterparts at extracting gold from worked-over claims and establishing profitable businesses serving the mining communities. The success of Chinese miners created resentment among European miners who blamed their economic difficulties on unfair competition from workers willing to accept lower wages and living standards. This racial tension would persist for decades and influence New Zealand immigration policy well into the 20th century. The wealth generated by gold mining flowed through the entire New Zealand economy, financing railway construction, urban development, and industrial expansion. The ports of Dunedin and later Christchurch grew rapidly as they processed the exports and imports that gold wealth made possible. Banks, shipping companies, and manufacturing businesses all benefited from the mining boom. But gold mining also created environmental destruction on an unprecedented scale. Entire river systems were altered as miners used hydraulic equipment to wash gold from hillsides. Forests were cleared to provide timber for mining operations. The landscape of the West Coast was permanently changed by decades of intensive mining activity. As the 19th century drew to a close, New Zealand was transforming from a small, struggling colony into a prosperous, modern nation. The population had grown from a few thousand Europeans and perhaps 100,000 Māori at the time of the Treaty of Waitangi to over 700,000 people by 1890. The economy had been revolutionized by agricultural exports, gold mining, and industrial development. The social and political innovations of the liberal era had established New Zealand as a progressive democracy that led the world in social reform. Women's suffrage, labour legislation, and social welfare programs made New Zealand a model for reformers in other countries. The country's reputation for progressive politics would become a defining characteristic that persisted well into the 20th century. Yet, these achievements came at enormous cost to the Māori population, whose numbers had declined to perhaps 40,000 by 1890. Disease, warfare, and social disruption had devastated Māori communities, leading some observers to predict that the Māori race would become extinct within a few generations. The great majority of New Zealand's land was now controlled by European settlers, and Māori political and economic power had been largely destroyed. The relationship between European and Māori New Zealanders remained tense and unresolved as the country approached the 20th century. The promises of the Treaty of Waitangi had been largely abandoned in practice, replaced by policies designed to assimilate Māori into European society or confine them to marginal reserves. The question of how these two peoples would coexist in the modern nation that New Zealand was becoming remained unanswered. The stage was set for the next chapter of New Zealand's development as the country prepared to enter the 20th century as a unified nation within the British Empire. The challenges of the modern world, 2 world wars, economic depression, and social change, would test the foundations that had been laid during the turbulent 19th century, and ultimately reshape New Zealand's understanding of itself and its place in the world. As New Zealand stepped into the 20th century, few could have predicted that this small nation, at the bottom of the world, would soon punch far above its weight on the global stage. The country that had been born from geological chaos and shaped by cultural collision was about to face its greatest test yet, not from internal conflicts or natural disasters, but from events unfolding on the other side of the planet. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 found New Zealand eager to prove its loyalty to the British Empire. When Britain declared war on Germany, New Zealand automatically became a combatant, and the response from ordinary New Zealanders was overwhelming. Young men lined up at recruitment offices in numbers that astonished even the most optimistic military planners. Within weeks, the country had committed to sending an expeditionary force that represented a larger percentage of the population than almost any other nation would contribute to the war effort. This enthusiasm wasn't born from militarism or imperial ambition. For many New Zealanders, the war represented an opportunity to demonstrate that their young nation could stand alongside the great powers of the world. The children and grandchildren of immigrants who had fled poverty and class oppression in Britain now saw themselves as defenders of civilization itself. They were determined to prove that colonial New Zealanders were every bit as brave and capable as their European cousins. The New Zealand and Australian Army Corps, better known as ANZAC, was formed to give the Dominions a distinct identity within the larger imperial war effort. These colonial troops were seen as tough, resourceful, and independent, qualities that their commanders hoped would prove valuable in the challenging conditions of modern warfare. But nothing could have prepared them for what they would encounter on the beaches of Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign was conceived as a bold stroke that would knock Turkey out of the war and open a new front against Germany. Instead, it became a nightmare of trench warfare in impossible terrain against a determined enemy who knew the ground intimately. The Anzac forces were landed on a narrow beach overlooked by steep cliffs honeycombed with Turkish defensive positions. From the moment they stepped ashore, they were trapped in a killing ground where every movement drew deadly fire. The conditions at Gallipoli were beyond anything that peacetime military training could simulate. The summer heat was unbearable, water was scarce, and disease ran rampant through the cramped trenches. Bodies lay unburied between the lines, creating a stench that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Yet the Anzac troops adapted to these hellish conditions with a stoicism and ingenuity that impressed even their enemies. The 8 months of fighting at Gallipoli cost New Zealand over 2,700 dead and 4,700 wounded from a population of barely 1 million. Proportionally, these losses were among the heaviest suffered by any nation during the entire war. Entire communities back home were devastated as casualty lists arrived with the names of local boys who would never return. The war that had begun with such enthusiasm was revealing its true face as an industrial-scale slaughter that consumed lives with mechanical efficiency. But Gallipoli also forged something new in the New Zealand national consciousness. The shared suffering and mutual dependence of men from different backgrounds created bonds that transcended the social divisions of peacetime society. Farmers' sons fought alongside city clerks. University graduates served beside men who had never learned to read. And Maori soldiers proved their courage alongside their European compatriots in ways that challenged racial stereotypes. The Maori contribution to the war effort was particularly significant, given the tensions that had marked race relations since the 19th century conflicts. Many Maori leaders saw military service as an opportunity to demonstrate their people's loyalty and earn recognition as full citizens of the emerging nation. The Maori Pioneer Battalion served with distinction in France, earning respect from their European comrades through their courage under fire and their skill at dangerous engineering tasks. Yet even in war, racial discrimination persisted. Maori soldiers were initially excluded from the main expeditionary force and had to fight for the right to serve in combat roles, rather than just support functions. When they finally reached the Western Front, they faced prejudice from some European officers who doubted their reliability under fire. These doubts were quickly dispelled by their performance in battle, but the underlying tensions revealed how much work remained to be done in building a truly unified nation. The Western Front campaigns that followed Gallipoli were even more devastating than the ill-fated Turkish adventure. The New Zealand division participated in some of the bloodiest battles in military history, including the Somme, Passchendaele, and the final Allied offensive that ended the war. These battles were fought in conditions that defied human comprehension. Vast networks of trenches separated by moonscapes of shell holes and barbed wire, where death waited for anyone foolish enough to show themselves above ground. The Battle of Passchendaele in 1917 epitomised the horror of industrial warfare. New Zealand troops were ordered to attack German positions across a wasteland of mud and water, where artillery bombardment had destroyed every trace of civilization. The village of Passchendaele, which gave the battle its name, had been so completely obliterated that soldiers couldn't tell where it had once stood. Men drowned in shell holes filled with liquid mud, and the wounded who couldn't crawl to safety simply disappeared into the morass. Yet somehow, New Zealand soldiers captured their objectives at Passchendaele and held them against desperate German counterattacks. The cost was appalling: over 2,700 casualties for a few hundred yards of worthless ground. But the achievement demonstrated a level of military effectiveness that placed New Zealand troops among the elite formations of the British Empire. Their success came at a price that would haunt the nation for generations. The technological innovations of modern warfare transformed not just military tactics, but the entire industrial base that supported the war effort. New Zealand's factories retooled to produce munitions, uniforms, and equipment for the imperial war machine. Farms expanded production to feed British populations threatened by German submarine warfare. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles that had previously been exclusively male domains. This industrial mobilization accelerated social changes that had been building throughout the Liberal era. The rigid class distinctions imported from Britain began to break down under the pressures of total war. Working-class women found themselves managing factories and farms while their social superiors rolled bandages and organized fundraising drives. The shared sacrifice of wartime created a more egalitarian society where individual contribution mattered more than family background. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 struck New Zealand with devastating force, just as the country was celebrating the armistice that ended the fighting. The disease killed over 9,000 New Zealanders in just a few months, adding to the grief of families who had already lost sons in the trenches. The pandemic revealed the vulnerability of isolated communities and the inadequacy of public health systems that had been designed for peacetime conditions. Māori communities were particularly hard hit by the influenza pandemic, with mortality rates significantly higher than among the European population. The disease spread rapidly through overcrowded rural settlements where access to medical care was limited. Traditional healing practices proved ineffective against this new disease, and many communities lost their elderly people, who were the repositories of cultural knowledge and oral history. The combined impact of war casualties and pandemic deaths left New Zealand a profoundly changed society. The optimism and confidence of the pre-war period had been replaced by a more sober understanding of the costs of modern civilization. The young men who returned from the battlefields brought with them memories and experiences that separated them from those who had remained at home. Many struggled to readjust to peacetime society, haunted by what they had seen and done during the war years. The economic disruption caused by the war and its aftermath created new challenges for a country that had prospered through agricultural exports. European markets were disrupted by political upheaval and economic instability. Competition from other agricultural exporters intensified as nations struggled to rebuild their shattered economies. New Zealand farmers who had expanded production during the war found themselves facing falling prices and mounting debts. The government responded to these challenges with increased intervention in the economy, establishing marketing boards and price support schemes that would become permanent features of New Zealand's economic system. The state that had pioneered social welfare now extended its role into areas that had previously been left to market forces. This expansion of government power reflected both practical necessity and changing attitudes about the role of the state in protecting citizens from economic hardship. The 1920s brought a period of relative prosperity as the global economy recovered from the disruptions of war. New Zealand's agricultural exports found new markets, and immigration resumed as Europeans sought opportunities in the Dominions. The country that had sent its young men to die in European trenches now attracted settlers fleeing the economic and political instability of post-war Europe. But this prosperity masked underlying weaknesses that would become apparent when the global economy collapsed at the end of the decade. New Zealand's dependence on agricultural exports made it vulnerable to international market fluctuations beyond its control. The country had developed few secondary industries during the war boom, leaving it dangerously exposed to changes in demand for primary products. The cultural flowering of the 1920s reflected New Zealand's growing confidence as a nation distinct from Britain while still maintaining its imperial connections. Literature, art, and music began to develop distinctively New Zealand characteristics that drew inspiration from the local landscape and experience rather than simply imitating European models. Writers like Catherine Mansfield achieved international recognition while drawing on their New Zealand backgrounds for material and inspiration. The emergence of radio broadcasting revolutionized communication and entertainment in a country where vast distances had previously isolated communities from each other. Families gathered around wireless sets to hear news, music, and drama from around the world. Radio created a shared national culture that transcended regional differences and connected New Zealand to global networks of information and entertainment. Sports became another arena where New Zealand could demonstrate its capabilities on the international stage. The All Blacks rugby team established a reputation for excellence that made them ambassadors for their country wherever they played. Success in sport provided a source of national pride that helped compensate for New Zealand's small size and geographical isolation. The haka that the team performed before matches introduced Māori culture to international audiences in ways that began to change global perceptions of indigenous peoples. Yet beneath the surface prosperity of the 1920s, significant tensions remained unresolved. The promises of post-war reconstruction had failed to materialize for many returned servicemen who struggled with unemployment, disability, and psychological trauma. Rural communities felt neglected by governments focused on urban industrial development. Most significantly, Maori communities remained marginalized despite their wartime contributions and continued to lose land through legal and administrative processes they couldn't control. The Native Land Court continued its work of individualizing Maori land tenure, breaking up communal ownership in ways that facilitated further sales to European purchasers. By the 1920s, Maori retained control of only about 4% of their original territory, and much of this was marginal land unsuitable for commercial development. The economic base that might have supported Maori recovery and development had been systematically eroded over decades of legal manipulation and administrative neglect. New forms of Maori political organisation emerged in response to these challenges. Leaders like Apirana Ngata and Peter Buck combined traditional authority with European education to advocate for their people within the existing political system. They established organisations like the Young Māori Party that sought to protect Maori interests while encouraging adaptation to modern conditions. These leaders faced the difficult task of preserving cultural identity while accepting the reality of European political and economic dominance. The development policies promoted by leaders like Ngata emphasised the importance of land consolidation and agricultural development as the foundation for Maori recovery. Rather than simply lamenting land loss, these pragmatic leaders worked to make the remaining Maori land more productive through improved farming techniques and cooperative marketing schemes. They recognised that economic success was essential for political influence and cultural survival. Educational initiatives became another focus of Maori political activity during this period. Leaders like Buck, who had trained as a doctor, demonstrated that Maori could succeed in European professional fields while maintaining their cultural identity. They established scholarship programs and mentoring networks designed to produce a generation of educated Maori who could advocate effectively for their people's interests. But these individual success stories couldn't address the broader problems facing Maori communities. The majority of Maori remained trapped in poverty on inadequate reserves or struggled as labourers in industries where they faced discrimination and limited opportunities for advancement. The social problems that would later explode into crisis, poor health, educational underachievement, and family breakdown, were already becoming apparent to perceptive observers. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 shattered the comfortable assumptions that had guided New Zealand policy since the end of the war. Agricultural prices collapsed as international markets contracted, leaving farmers unable to service debts incurred during the prosperous 1920s. Unemployment soared as businesses closed and construction projects were abandoned. The government's finances deteriorated rapidly as tax revenues fell and demand for social services increased. The human cost of the Depression was devastating for a society that had prided itself on providing opportunities for all its citizens. Men who had worked steadily for decades found themselves queuing for relief work or government handouts. Families lost their homes and farms as banks foreclosed on unpayable mortgages. The social fabric that had been woven together during the war years began to unravel under economic pressure. The political response to the Depression revealed deep divisions within New Zealand society about the proper role of government and the distribution of economic hardship. The Conservative United Party government initially tried to restore confidence through orthodox financial policies, balancing budgets, maintaining the gold standard, and waiting for natural recovery. But these policies only deepened the crisis by reducing government spending just when economic stimulus was most needed. The formation of the Labour Party government in 1935 marked a watershed in New Zealand political development. Under the leadership of Michael Joseph Savage, Labour promised a comprehensive programme of social reform designed to protect ordinary citizens from the worst effects of economic instability. The party's slogan, "Applied Christianity," reflected its commitment to creating a more just and equitable society through government action. The first Labour government's achievements were remarkable by any measure. They established a comprehensive social security system that provided unemployment benefits, old age pensions, and free healthcare for all citizens. They created public works programs that provided employment while building essential infrastructure. Most dramatically, they began construction of state houses designed to provide decent accommodation for working-class families at affordable rents. These social reforms established New Zealand as one of the world's most advanced welfare states, building on the progressive traditions established during the Liberal era. The country that had pioneered women's suffrage now led the world in social security, demonstrating that small nations could innovate in ways that influenced much larger countries. Visitors from Britain and the United States came to study New Zealand's social experiments and consider their application elsewhere. But the Labour government's reforms also had complex implications for race relations and national identity. The social security system was designed primarily for European New Zealanders who lived in nuclear families and participated in wage labour. Maori communities, with their different social structures and economic patterns, often found it difficult to access benefits or services designed for European cultural norms. The state housing programme, while providing decent accommodation for thousands of European families, often served to reinforce racial segregation by concentrating Maori families in particular neighbourhoods or excluding them entirely from new developments. Well-intentioned policies designed to create a more egalitarian society sometimes perpetuated racial inequalities that their architects failed to recognise or address. The approach of World War II found New Zealand far better prepared psychologically and economically than it had been in 1914. The lessons of the previous war had taught political and military leaders to plan more carefully for the demands of total war. The social reforms of the 1930s had created a more cohesive society with stronger institutions capable of mobilizing national resources effectively. Yet the Second World War would prove even more challenging than the First. requiring New Zealand to defend its own territory against direct attack, while also contributing to Allied campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. The country that had sent its young men to die in Turkish hills and French trenches now faced the possibility that enemy forces might land on its own beaches. The transformation of New Zealand, from a small agricultural colony to a modern welfare state capable of defending itself and contributing to global conflicts, had been achieved in less than a century. The foundations laid during this remarkable period of development would shape the country's response to the even greater challenges that lay ahead as the world entered an era of global warfare and revolutionary change. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed World War II from a distant European conflict into an immediate threat to New Zealand's survival. Within hours of the news reaching Wellington, the reality hit home. Enemy forces were now operating in the Pacific Ocean, potentially just weeks away from New Zealand's shores. The comfortable assumption that the Royal Navy would protect the Dominions from any serious threat had been shattered by the devastating efficiency of Japanese naval aviation. Prime Minister Peter Fraser faced an impossible choice that would define New Zealand's entire wartime strategy. Should the country recall its forces from the Middle East to defend the homeland, or continue supporting Britain's war effort while leaving New Zealand vulnerable to invasion? The decision Fraser made revealed how much the nation's strategic thinking had matured since 1914. Unlike the previous war, when New Zealand had automatically subordinated its interests to imperial strategy, the government now demanded a voice in Allied planning that reflected the country's vital interests. The threat was real and immediate. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with a speed that shocked Western military planners. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress that was meant to anchor British defences in the Pacific, fell in February 1942 after a campaign that exposed the weakness of imperial military planning. The loss of Singapore sent shockwaves through New Zealand, where many had relatives serving in the doomed garrison. For the first time since European settlement, New Zealand faced the genuine possibility of invasion by a hostile foreign power. Coastal defences that had been largely ceremonial suddenly became matters of life and death. Beaches that had welcomed tourists and picnickers were strung with barbed wire and studded with concrete bunkers. Citizens who had never imagined war coming to their peaceful islands found themselves digging air raid shelters in their backyards. The government's response was swift and comprehensive. Conscription was extended to include all able-bodied men, while women were mobilised for essential war work on an unprecedented scale. Factories that had produced butter and wool now manufactured ammunition and aircraft parts. The entire economy was reorganised around the demands of total war, with government controls extending into every aspect of daily life. The arrival of American forces in 1942 marked another turning point in New Zealand's development. For the first time in the country's history, its defence depended not on British protection, but on alliance with a foreign power that many New Zealanders had previously viewed with suspicion. The presence of thousands of American servicemen in New Zealand's cities and towns created cultural tensions and opportunities that would influence the country's post-war development. The Americans brought with them not just military protection, but also exposure to different ways of thinking about democracy, race relations, and economic organisation. Many New Zealanders were shocked by the racial segregation practiced by American forces, which contrasted sharply with New Zealand's more egalitarian ideals. The treatment of Maori servicemen by American commanders who tried to enforce their own country's racial hierarchies created diplomatic incidents that revealed the complexity of wartime alliances. Yet the American presence also brought benefits that extended far beyond military security. American technology, management techniques, and industrial methods were transferred to New Zealand factories and farms. The country's manufacturing capabilities expanded dramatically under wartime pressure, creating an industrial base that would support post-war prosperity. More importantly, exposure to American approaches to problem-solving and innovation began to influence New Zealand's own development strategies. The Pacific War campaigns revealed both the strengths and limitations of New Zealand's military capabilities. The country's naval and air forces, small though they were, proved remarkably effective in anti-submarine warfare and reconnaissance operations that helped secure vital supply lines. New Zealand pilots flying obsolete aircraft achieved remarkable success against more modern Japanese fighters through superior training and tactical innovation. But the ground forces that had performed so well in the desert campaigns of North Africa struggled initially to adapt to the jungle warfare of the Pacific Islands. The techniques that had worked against German and Italian forces in open terrain proved inadequate against Japanese defenders who had perfected the art of camouflage and defensive positions in tropical conditions. New Zealand soldiers had to learn entirely new skills while fighting for their lives on remote islands whose names few had heard before the war. The casualties suffered in Pacific campaigns like Guadalcanal and Bougainville were proportionally as heavy as those endured during World War I, but they received less attention from a public focused on the immediate threat of invasion. The young men who died in steaming jungles thousands of miles from home were fighting for New Zealand's survival in ways that were more direct than their father's sacrifice in European trenches had been. The home front during World War II was characterized by a level of social mobilization that exceeded even the efforts of 1914-1918. Women entered the workforce not just as temporary replacements for men, but as permanent participants in industries that had previously excluded them entirely. The skills and confidence gained during wartime employment would fuel demands for greater equality that would reshape post-war society. Māori participation in the war effort was more extensive and better integrated than during the previous conflict. The Māori battalion that fought in North Africa and Italy became one of the most decorated units in New Zealand military history, earning recognition that helped challenge racial stereotypes and promote greater understanding between the communities. The courage displayed by Maori soldiers in battles like El Alamein and Monte Cassino demonstrated their commitment to defending a country that had not always treated them fairly. Yet even wartime unity couldn't completely overcome the legacy of colonial dispossession and discrimination. Maori communities remained disproportionately affected by poverty, poor health, and limited educational opportunities. The war created opportunities for some individuals to advance, but the structural inequalities that confined most Maori to marginal economic roles remained largely unchanged. The scientific and technological advances stimulated by wartime necessity transformed New Zealand's capabilities in ways that would influence the country's development for decades. Radar stations that had been built to detect enemy aircraft became the foundation for meteorological and communications systems. The aviation industry that had emerged to train pilots and maintain military aircraft provided expertise that would support post-war commercial aviation. Most importantly, the experience of managing complex technological systems under extreme pressure created a generation of engineers and technicians who would drive post-war modernization. Agricultural production during the war required innovations that revolutionized New Zealand farming methods. The need to maximize food production while releasing men for military service forced farmers to adopt mechanical and chemical techniques that had been developing slowly during the interwar period. Tractors replaced horses, artificial fertilizers boosted yields, and scientific breeding programs improved livestock quality. These changes laid the foundation for the agricultural productivity that would drive post-war prosperity. The social changes accelerated by wartime necessity created tensions that would reshape New Zealand politics for generations. Women who had managed factories and farms were reluctant to return to purely domestic roles when peace returned. Workers who had gained new skills and responsibilities demanded better wages and working conditions. Veterans who had seen the world and fought for democracy expected their sacrifices to be rewarded with better opportunities and more egalitarian treatment. The rationing and shortages that characterized wartime life also created a more egalitarian society by forcing all citizens to accept similar restrictions on their consumption. Wealthy families who had previously enjoyed privileges based on their economic status found themselves queuing for the same limited supplies as their working-class neighbours. This shared sacrifice created bonds of solidarity that would influence post-war social policy. The end of the war in 1945 found New Zealand profoundly changed by 6 years of total mobilisation. The country that had entered the conflict as an agricultural exporter dependent on British markets emerged as a more diversified economy with significant manufacturing capabilities and stronger ties to the Pacific region. The population had become more urbanised, more educated, and more aware of the wider world than ever before. Yet victory brought new challenges that were in some ways more complex than those of wartime. The return of hundreds of thousands of servicemen created enormous pressures on housing, employment, and social services. The government's promise that veterans would return to a better society required massive investment in infrastructure, education, and social programs at a time when the country's finances were strained by war debts and reduced export earnings. The international situation that emerged from the war's end was fundamentally different from the world that New Zealand had known before 1939. Britain, exhausted by 6 years of conflict, was no longer the dominant global power that had protected the dominions for over a century. The United States and Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers whose rivalry would define international relations for decades to come. New Zealand faced the challenge of finding its place in this transformed global order while maintaining its independence and protecting its interests. The decolonization movements that swept through Asia and Africa in the wake of the war created new nations that challenged the racial hierarchies and imperial structures that had shaped the global order since the 19th century. New Zealand, as a predominantly European settler society in the Pacific, found itself having to justify its existence and policies in ways that previous generations had never contemplated. The nuclear weapons that had ended the war in the Pacific created new categories of threat that made traditional concepts of defense obsolete. A country that had always relied on distance and naval protection for security now faced the possibility of destruction from weapons that could cross oceans in minutes. The comfortable assumptions about safety and isolation that had shaped New Zealand's strategic shattered. The social thinking since European settlement were permanently democratic consensus that emerged from the war years would dominate New Zealand politics for the next 3 decades. Both major political parties accepted the need for an expanded welfare state, full employment policies, and government intervention in the economy. The ideological conflicts that had divided the country during the Depression were replaced by pragmatic debates about the best methods for achieving shared goals of prosperity and security. This consensus was built on the foundation of remarkable economic growth that began in the late 1940s and continued with only minor interruptions until the 1970s. Rising agricultural prices, expanding manufacturing industries, and growing domestic consumption created opportunities for advancement that fulfilled many of the promises made to the wartime generation. Home ownership became accessible to ordinary working families. University education expanded beyond the traditional elite, and consumer goods that had once been luxuries became standard features of middle-class life. The baby boom that followed the war created pressures and opportunities that would reshape New Zealand society in fundamental ways. The need to provide schools, housing, and services for millions of new children required massive public investment that expanded government capabilities and created new professional classes. The generation born in the decade after the war would grow up with expectations and opportunities that their parents could hardly have imagined. Yet prosperity also revealed the limitations and contradictions of the post-war settlement. The economic growth that lifted European New Zealand living standards to unprecedented heights largely bypassed Māori communities, who remained concentrated in rural areas where traditional industries were declining. The migration of Māori families to cities in search of employment created new forms of social dislocation and cultural tension that would explode into crisis during the 1960s and 1970s. The immigration policies that brought thousands of new settlers from Britain and Europe during the 1950s and 1960s were designed to maintain New Zealand's character as a British society in the Pacific. But these new immigrants brought with them different experiences and expectations that gradually challenged the conservative social attitudes that had dominated New Zealand culture since settlement. The arrival of refugees from Eastern Europe and later from other parts of the world began the slow transformation of New Zealand into a genuinely multicultural society. The development of television broadcasting in the 1960s created a shared national culture in ways that radio had begun but could not complete. For the first time, all New Zealanders could witness the same events simultaneously, creating common experiences that transcended regional and class differences. But television also exposed New Zealand to global cultural influences that challenged local traditions and created new forms of social tension. The protest movements that emerged during the 1960s reflected both the confidence and the frustrations of the post-war generation. Young New Zealanders who had grown up expecting prosperity and opportunity began to question the social conventions and political arrangements that their parents had accepted. The civil rights movement in the United States, the anti-war protests against Vietnam, and the cultural revolution that swept through Western societies all had their echoes in New Zealand. The most significant of these protest movements was the resurgence of Māori political activism that began in the 1960s and gathered momentum through the following decades. A new generation of educated Māori leaders, frustrated by the slow pace of progress through conventional political channels, began to demand more radical changes in government policies and social attitudes. The land marches, occupations, and legal challenges that characterised this movement forced all New Zealanders to confront the unresolved legacy of colonization. The economic shocks of the 1970s shattered the comfortable assumptions about perpetual growth and full employment that had dominated post-war thinking. The oil crises that quadrupled energy prices, the collapse of agricultural commodity prices, and the end of preferential access to British markets created challenges that existing policies could not address. The social democratic consensus that had guided New Zealand politics for 3 decades began to fracture under the pressure of economic reality. The response to these crises would ultimately transform New Zealand more dramatically than any events since European colonization. The economic reforms that began hesitantly in the early 1980s and accelerated through the rest of the decade dismantled much of the regulatory framework that had shaped New Zealand society since the 1930s. The country that had pioneered the welfare state became a laboratory for market-oriented reforms that influenced economic policy around the world. But these changes came at enormous social cost that revealed the tensions and inequalities that prosperity had previously concealed. The unemployment and social dislocation created by economic restructuring fell disproportionately on Māori and Pacific Island communities, who had been the last to benefit from post-war prosperity. The promises of greater efficiency and competitiveness were achieved through sacrifices that not all New Zealanders were equally able to bear. The cultural renaissance that accompanied these economic upheavals represented another form of response to the challenges facing New Zealand society. The flowering of Māori arts, literature, and political expression during the 1980s and 1990s created new forms of national identity that acknowledged the country's bicultural heritage more honestly than previous generations had been willing to do. The settlement of historical grievances through the Waitangi tribunal process, while contentious and incomplete, represented a genuine attempt to address the injustices of colonization. The globalization that accelerated during the final decades of the 20th century presented New Zealand with opportunities and challenges that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The country that had once depended entirely on agricultural exports to Britain now exported services manufactured goods, and cultural products to markets around the world. The isolation that had shaped New Zealand's development for over a century was replaced by connections that made events on the other side of the planet immediately relevant to local communities. Yet globalization also created new forms of vulnerability that echoed the challenges of earlier periods. The dependence on international markets that had made New Zealand prosperous also made it subject to economic forces beyond its control. The environmental costs of intensive agriculture and industrial development began to threaten the natural heritage that had always been central to New Zealand's identity. The social changes that accompanied economic modernization challenged traditional institutions and relationships in ways that created both opportunities and anxieties. The emergence of New Zealand as a leader in environmental conservation and Indigenous rights during the late 20th century represented a new form of international influence based on moral authority rather than military or economic power. The country that had once been shaped by global forces beyond its control began to influence international debates about sustainability, social justice, and cultural preservation. The nuclear-free policy that had created diplomatic tensions with traditional allies established New Zealand as an independent voice in international affairs. The transformation of New Zealand from a remote British colony to a modern Pacific nation had taken less than 2 centuries. But the changes had been so profound that the country of 2000 bore little resemblance to the land that European settlers had first encountered. The giant birds and pristine forests were gone, replaced by cities, farms, and industrial landscapes. The Māori population that had seemed destined for extinction had recovered and was asserting its rights with growing confidence. The European settlers who had sought to recreate Britain in the South Pacific had created something entirely new and distinctly their own. The challenges facing New Zealand as it entered the 21st century were different from those that had confronted earlier generations, but they required the same qualities of adaptability, innovation, and determination that had enabled the country to survive and prosper through previous crises. The geological forces that had shaped the islands continued to remind inhabitants that they lived on the edge of tectonic plates, where change was the only constant. The cultural forces that had created a unique blend of indigenous and settler traditions continued to evolve in response to new influences and opportunities. The new millennium found New Zealand grappling with questions that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. How could a country of fewer than 4 million people maintain its distinctive identity in an increasingly homogenized global culture? How could the promises of biculturalism be reconciled with the reality of growing ethnic diversity as immigrants arrived from Asia, the Pacific Islands, and other parts of the world? Most fundamentally, how could New Zealand balance its commitment to environmental preservation with the economic pressures of competing in global markets? The answer to these questions began to emerge through a series of bold policy experiments that would once again establish New Zealand as a laboratory for social innovation. The Resource Management Act of 1991 had already begun to reshape how New Zealanders thought about their relationship with the natural environment, placing sustainability at the centre of planning decisions in ways that challenged traditional approaches to development. But this was just the beginning of a transformation that would touch every aspect of national life. The settlement of historical grievances through the Waitangi tribunal process gathered momentum during the 1990s and 2000s, creating a new framework for relationships between Māori and the Crown. These settlements weren't just about money or land. They represented a fundamental rethinking of New Zealand's founding narrative. The comfortable myth of peaceful colonization was replaced by honest acknowledgement of the injustices and broken promises that had characterized much of the 19th and 20th centuries. The Ngāi Tahu settlement of 1998 demonstrated how historical justice could be combined with economic development in ways that benefited entire regions. The iwi that had been dispossessed of most of its South Island territories during the 1860s emerged from the settlement process as one of New Zealand's most successful corporate entities, using traditional values to guide modern business practices. Their success challenged stereotypes about Maori capabilities, while providing a model for other iwi seeking to rebuild their economic base. But the settlement process also revealed the complexity of addressing historical injustices in a modern democratic society. Not all New Zealanders were comfortable with policies that seemed to grant special privileges based on ethnicity, particularly when those policies affected access to natural resources or public services. The debates that surrounded these issues reflected deeper questions about citizenship, equality, and the role of historical grievances in contemporary politics. The immigration policies of the 1990s and 2000s transformed New Zealand's demographic composition more rapidly than any previous period since European settlement. The points-based system that replaced earlier preferences for British and European immigrants opened the country to skilled migrants from Asia, creating vibrant new communities in Auckland, Wellington, and other major centres. Chinese New Zealanders, Korean New Zealanders, and Indian New Zealanders became significant ethnic minorities with their own cultural institutions and political voices. This diversification created opportunities and tensions that challenged traditional concepts of New Zealand identity. The biculturalism that had been carefully negotiated between Maori and European New Zealanders suddenly seemed inadequate to describe a society that included dozens of ethnic communities with their own languages, religions, and cultural practices. Politicians and community leaders struggled to develop new models of multiculturalism that could accommodate this diversity while maintaining social cohesion. Auckland, in particular, became a laboratory for multicultural society as immigrants concentrated in the city that offered the best economic opportunities. By 2006, Auckland was one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world, with no single ethnic group comprising a majority of the population. The success of this experiment in diversity would have profound implications for New Zealand's future development and its role in the Pacific region. The economic policies that had been implemented during the 1980s and 1990s continued to reshape New Zealand society in ways that were both beneficial and problematic. The deregulation of industries like telecommunications and banking had created more efficient services and lower prices for consumers. The floating of the exchange rate had forced businesses to become more competitive and innovative. But these changes had also created new forms of inequality and social dislocation that challenged the egalitarian traditions that had long defined New Zealand culture. The housing market became a particularly visible symbol of these changes. The home ownership that had been accessible to ordinary working families during the post-war boom became increasingly difficult to achieve as house prices rose faster than incomes. The quarter-acre section that had symbolised New Zealand middle-class aspirations was replaced by smaller sections and higher-density housing as urban land became more valuable. These changes reflected broader economic trends, but also created anxiety about the kind of society New Zealand was becoming. The rise of the internet and digital technologies during the 1990s and 2000s had revolutionary implications for a country that had always struggled with the tyranny of distance. Suddenly, New Zealand businesses could access global markets without the delays and costs that had previously made international trade difficult. Creative industries like film production, software development, and digital design could compete on equal terms with companies located in major world centres. The success of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy demonstrated the potential of these new technologies to transform traditional industries. The films, produced in New Zealand using local talent and international financing, created a global brand that associated New Zealand with creativity, technical excellence, and stunning natural beauty. The tourism boom that followed brought millions of international visitors eager to experience Middle-earth for themselves. But digital technologies also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies that previous generations hadn't faced. The global financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated how quickly economic problems on the other side of the world could affect New Zealand employment and living standards. The country's small domestic market meant that most businesses depended heavily on export earnings or international investment, making them vulnerable to changes in global economic conditions. The environmental challenges that emerged during this period required new approaches to problems that had been building for decades. Climate change, though still controversial in some quarters, was beginning to create measurable impacts on New Zealand's agricultural systems and natural ecosystems. The dairy industry that had become the backbone of the export economy was coming under increasing scrutiny for its environmental impacts, particularly water pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. The response to these environmental challenges revealed both the strengths and limitations of New Zealand's democratic institutions. The emissions trading scheme introduced in 2008 represented an innovative attempt to use market mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but its implementation revealed the difficulty of balancing environmental goals with economic interests. The scheme was modified several times as politicians struggled to find approaches that would be both environmentally effective and economically acceptable. Water quality became another flashpoint for debates about environmental protection versus economic development. The intensive dairy farming that had made New Zealand one of the world's most efficient food producers had also contributed to pollution of rivers and lakes that had once been among the cleanest in the world. The discovery that many previously pristine waterways were no longer safe for swimming shocked a public that had taken environmental quality for granted. The political response to these environmental challenges reflected the maturation of New Zealand's democratic institutions. The mixed-member proportional electoral system that had been introduced in 1996 created space for minor parties focused on environmental issues, forcing major parties to take these concerns more seriously. The Green Party's consistent representation in Parliament ensured that environmental perspectives were part of most major policy debates. The Treaty of Waitangi settlements continued to reshape relationships between Māori and other New Zealanders throughout the 2000s and 2010s. The Waikato Tainui settlement in 1995 and the subsequent settlements with Ngati Porou, Te Arawa and other major iwi created a new class of Māori corporate entities with significant economic and political influence. These organisations used their settlements to rebuild their economic base while maintaining their cultural identity and supporting their communities. The success of post-settlement iwi challenged many assumptions about Māori capabilities and aspirations. Organisations like Kiwi Bank, which was established with Māori investment, demonstrated that traditional values could be successfully applied to modern business practices. Māori language immersion schools showed remarkable success in raising educational achievement while preserving cultural knowledge. These successes created new models for Indigenous development that attracted international attention. But the settlement process also revealed ongoing tensions about the role of ethnicity in New Zealand society. The establishment of the Māori Party in 2004 reflected frustration with the pace of progress through mainstream political channels, but it also created anxiety among some New Zealanders who worried about the development of separate political institutions based on ethnicity. These debates reflected deeper questions about citizenship and belonging that had never been fully resolved. The global financial crisis of 2008 tested New Zealand's economic resilience in ways that revealed both the benefits and costs of the market-oriented reforms implemented during previous decades. The banking system that had been deregulated during the 1980s proved remarkably stable compared to financial systems in other countries, partly because of prudential regulations that had been maintained despite the general trend toward deregulation. But the crisis also revealed New Zealand's vulnerability to global economic shocks. The country's high levels of foreign debt meant that international credit conditions directly affected domestic interest rates and economic growth. The export industries that employed hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders faced sudden reductions in demand as their traditional markets contracted. Unemployment rose sharply for the first time in over a decade, creating hardship for families who had assumed that economic growth was a permanent feature of modern life. The government's response to the financial crisis demonstrated both continuity and change in New Zealand's approach to economic management. The fiscal stimulus packages and monetary policy responses drew on Keynesian economic principles that had been largely abandoned during the 1980s and 1990s. But these interventions were temporary measures designed to address an emergency rather than a return to the interventionist policies of the mid-20th century. The Canterbury earthquakes of 2010 and 2011 created challenges that went far beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis. The destruction of much of central Christchurch, New Zealand's second-largest city, required reconstruction efforts on a scale that had no precedent in the country's peacetime history. The disaster revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of New Zealand's institutions and social solidarity. The immediate response to the earthquakes demonstrated the resilience and mutual support that had characterized New Zealand society since European settlement. Ordinary citizens organized rescue efforts, provided shelter for displaced families, and contributed to relief funds with a generosity that impressed international observers. The student volunteer army that emerged from the University of Canterbury became a symbol of young New Zealanders' commitment to their communities, and so we reach the end of our extraordinary journey through New Zealand's complete history. From those ancient days when giant moa roamed pristine forests, to the modern nation that stands today as a beacon of innovation and environmental stewardship, we've witnessed one of humanity's most remarkable transformations. This small country, born from geological violence and shaped by cultural collision, has consistently punched above its weight on the world stage, pioneering social reforms, leading environmental initiatives, and showing that size doesn't determine significance. The story of New Zealand proves that with courage, adaptability, and respect for both heritage and progress, any nation can forge its own unique path in our interconnected world.